Dangerous Gambler's Choice. Bonnie McCall had spent 10 years trying to forget Jesse Landry, the outlaw who vanished without a word. But when he rode back into town dusty, dangerous, and looking at her like she was still his, she knew her past had finally caught up. He smirked, tilting his hat. "Didn't think I'd come back for you, did you, darlin'?" he murmured. "Reckon we got unfinished business." Chapter 1. 10 years gone. The sun beat down on Harmony Creek with the same relentless fury it had for the past decade. Dust devils danced across the parched main street, swirling past the weathered storefronts and the faded sign of the Golden Barrel Saloon. Bonnie McCall watched them from the porch of her general store, a worn broom held loosely in her hand. 10 years. 10 years since Jesse Landry had ridden out of her life, leaving behind nothing but a hollow ache and a town full of whispers. She tightened her grip on the broom handle, the rough wood a familiar comfort against her calloused palm. The years had etched lines around her eyes, a roadmap of worry and sleepless nights, but they hadn't dulled the vibrant auburn of her hair, now streaked with silver, or the fierce determination in her emerald green eyes. She was 48 now, a far cry from the impetuous girl who'd given her heart to a charming outlaw. A rhythmic thump, thump, thump echoed down the street, the sound of approaching hooves. Bonnie's breath hitched. It couldn't be. Not after all this time. Yet, her heart, that stubborn, traitorous organ, hammered against her ribs with a frantic rhythm she hadn't felt in years. She leaned forward, squinting against the glare. A lone rider emerged from the swirling dust, his silhouette stark against the blinding light. Tall, broad-shouldered, and sitting his horse with an easy grace that was undeniably familiar. Her hand flew to her chest, a futile attempt to still the sudden tremor that ran through her. As he drew closer, details sharpened. The worn leather chaps, the dusty Stetson pulled low over his eyes, the glint of a silver buckle on his gun belt. And then he looked up. His eyes, the same startling shade of blue as a mountain lake, locked with hers. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, the kind that used to make her knees weak. It was him, Jesse Landry. Back. He reined in his horse just before her porch, the animal snorting and pawing at the dusty ground. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements as effortless and dangerous as a coiled rattlesnake. He stood there, a ghost from her past made flesh, his presence filling the space between them with a tension that crackled like a dry lightning storm. "Didn't think I'd come back for you, did you, darlin'?" he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent shivers down her spine. It was the same voice that had whispered promises in the moonlight, the same voice that had haunted her dreams for a decade. "Reckon we got unfinished business." Bonnie straightened, her spine stiffening with a resolve born of years of self-reliance. She wouldn't let him see how his return had shaken her. She wouldn't let him see the flicker of something that still burned deep within her. "You left, Jesse," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. 10 years ago. There's no business left between us." He tilted his head, his eyes glinting with amusement and something else, something darker, that she couldn't quite decipher. "Is that so, Bonnie? Seems to me some things ain't so easily forgotten." He took a step closer, the scent of leather, dust, and something wild and untamed reaching her. It was a scent she'd tried, and failed, to erase from her memory. "You should have stayed gone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent another shiver through her. "Now, where's the fun in that?" He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek. It was a fleeting touch, barely there, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her, awakening sensations she thought long dead. She flinched, stepping back, the broom falling from her grasp and clattering onto the wooden porch. "Don't," she said, her voice sharper now. "Don't touch me." His smile faded, replaced by a look of regret. It was hard to tell. His face was a mask of shadows and angles, etched with the harsh realities of a life lived on the run. 10 years is a long time, Bonnie, he said, his voice softer now, almost a caress. But some things are worth coming back for. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping over the familiar storefronts, the dusty street, the distant maces shimmering in the heat. Harmony Creek hasn't changed much, he observed. It has, Bonnie countered, her voice tight. People move on, Jessie. They have to. He turned back to her, his blue eyes searching hers. Have you, Bonnie? Moved on, I mean? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. She wanted to lie, to tell him she'd forgotten him, that she'd built the life without him, a life where he had no place. But the truth, raw and painful, caught in her throat. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of anger, resentment, and a lingering, undeniable spark of something she wouldn't, name. You have no right to ask me that, she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Maybe not, he conceded. But I'm asking anyway. A sudden commotion erupted down the street. A group of men, rough-looking and armed, were spilling out of the saloon, their voices raised in drunken shouts. Jesse's hand instinctively went to the gun at his hip. Looks like trouble, he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Bonnie followed his gaze, her heart sinking. It was the Kincaid gang, notorious for their ruthlessness and their penchant for stirring up trouble in Harmony Creek. They were the reason the town had hired a new sheriff, a stern, no-nonsense man named Jedediah Stone, just 6 months ago. Stay out of it, Jessie, Bonnie pleaded, her voice laced with a desperate urgency. This isn't your fight. He gave her a wry smile. Darlin', he said, trouble's always been my fight. And with that, he turned and walked towards the approaching men, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, a figure of both menace and a strange, undeniable kind of grace. Bonnie watched him go, her heart a tangled knot of fear, anger, and a flicker of something she desperately wished wasn't there. He was back. And everything had changed. Chapter 2. Dust and Echoes. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale beer and impending violence as Jesse approached the Kincaid gang. He recognized a few of the faces, hard men with eyes that held the cold glint of desperation. They were spoiling for a fight, their drunken bravado fueled by cheap whiskey and a deep-seated resentment for anyone who represented law and order, even if, in his current situation, he hardly did. Well, drawled a burly man with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. Look what the cat dragged in. If it ain't Jesse Landry. Back from the dead, are we? Jesse's hand tightened on his gun, but he kept his voice even. Just passing through, Kincaid. No need for trouble. Kincaid laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Passing through, he says. You think we're fools, Landry? We know why you're here. You're after the same thing we are. Jesse raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. And what's that, Kincaid? Don't play coy with me, outlaw, Kincaid spat. The stagecoach. The one carrying the gold shipment from the Black Ridge mine. We know it's coming through here tomorrow. Jesse let a slow smile spread across his face. So that was it. The Kincaids were planning a robbery. And they assumed he was there to join them, or perhaps, to steal their prize. He had, in his younger days, been known for his less-than-legal acquisition of wealth. But that was a lifetime ago. Or so he'd hoped. You got it wrong, Kincaid, Jesse said, his voice low and dangerous. I'm not interested in your petty schemes. Kincaid's eyes narrowed. You expect us to believe that? You, Jesse Landry, the man who could outride, outshoot, and outsmart any lawman in the territory? You're suddenly a changed man? People change, Kincaid, Jesse said, his gaze unwavering. Or they die. The words hung in the air, a silent challenge. The other men in the gang shifted uneasily, their hands hovering near their weapons. Bonnie, watching from the porch, felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She knew Jesse could handle himself, but he was outnumbered, and the Kincaids were known for their brutality. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. That's enough, Kincaid. Sheriff Jedediah Stone strode out of his office, his hand resting on the star pinned to his chest. He was a tall, imposing figure, his face weathered and lined, his eyes as sharp and cold as the steel of his gun. He had a reputation for being unyielding, a man who followed the law to the letter, and Bonnie had felt a sense of relief, of safety, when he'd arrived in town. Now, though, seeing him face off against Jesse alongside the Kincaids, a new kind of fear gripped her. "This is between me and Landry, Sheriff," Kincaid growled. Stone's gaze flickered to Jesse, then back to Kincaid. "Anything that happens in my town is my business, Kincaid. And I'm telling you to stand down." Kincaid hesitated, his eyes darting between the sheriff and Jesse. He knew he couldn't win a fight against both of them, not without risking serious losses. He spat on the ground, a gesture of defiance. "This ain't over, Landry," he snarled. "We'll meet again." With that, he turned and stalked back into the saloon, his gang following close behind. Sheriff Stone watched them go, his expression unreadable. Then, he turned his attention to Jesse. "Landry," he said, his voice flat. "I thought I'd seen the last of you." "Sheriff," Jesse replied, his voice equally devoid of emotion. "Just passing through." Stone's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me, Landry. I know your reputation. You're not here for a social visit." Jesse met his gaze, his expression unyielding. "I'm not looking for trouble, Sheriff. But I won't run from it either." Stone studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching, probing. Bonnie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the sheriff wouldn't hesitate to arrest Jesse, regardless of his past or her feelings. Finally, Stone nodded.
"See that you don't," he said.
"I'm watching you, Landry. One wrong move, and you'll be spending the night in my jail." He turned and walked back into his office, leaving Jesse standing alone in the dusty street. Bonnie let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She wanted to go to him, to ask him why he was really back, what he wanted, but she couldn't. Not yet. The years of hurt and betrayal were a wall between them, a barrier she wasn't sure could ever be breached. Jesse turned and looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of emotions she couldn't decipher. He started to walk towards her, then hesitated. He glanced back at the saloon, then at the sheriff's office, his face a mask of conflict. Finally, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked towards the livery stable, disappearing into the shadows. Bonnie watched him go, her heart aching with a longing she thought she'd buried long ago. The dust settled, the echoes of the confrontation faded, but the tension remained, a heavy weight in the air. He was back, and nothing would ever be the same. The quiet life she'd painstakingly built for herself was shattered, replaced by a whirlwind of uncertainty and the haunting presence of the man she'd once loved, the man who was now a stranger, an outlaw, a ghost from her past. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the reckoning had only just begun. The quiet hum of the approaching evening, normally a comfort, now sounded like a warning. Chapter 3. The Devil's Bargain. The inside of the Golden Barrel Saloon was dim and smoky, the air thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and desperation. Jesse sat alone at a corner table, nursing a drink, his eyes scanning the room. He'd seen the wary glances, the whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when he looked their way. He was an outsider, a pariah, a reminder of a past that Harmony Creek wanted to forget. He wasn't surprised. He'd left under a cloud, accused of a crime he hadn't committed, a crime that had cost Bonnie's father his life. The memory still stung, a raw wound that time hadn't healed. He'd been framed, set up by someone he'd trusted, someone who'd wanted him out of the picture. He'd spent the last 10 years trying to clear his name, trying to find the evidence that would prove his innocence. And now, he was back, drawn by a cryptic message, a hint that the truth might finally be within his reach. A shadow fell over his table. He looked up, expecting to see Sheriff Stone, or perhaps one of Kincaid's men. Instead, he found himself face to face with a woman he hadn't seen in years. Sarah Jenkins, Bonnie's best friend. "Jesse," she said, her voice hesitant. "I need to talk to you." Sarah had aged, but her eyes, the same warm brown as Bonnie's, still held a spark of kindness. She'd always been a loyal friend, to both him and Bonnie, even when the whole town had turned against him. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "It's good to see you." She sat down opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I saw what happened out there," she said, her voice low, "with Kincaid and the sheriff." "It's nothing I can't handle," Jessie replied. Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand, Jessie. Things have changed here. Kincaid's got his hooks in deep. He practically runs this town." "And the sheriff?" Jessie asked. Sarah hesitated. "He's complicated. He's tough, no doubt about it. But there are whispers that he's not as clean as he appears." Jessie leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What kind of rumors?" "That he's taking bribes from Kincaid," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "That he's turning a blind eye to their activities." Jessie felt a chill run down his spine. If the sheriff was corrupt, then he was walking into a trap. He had no one he could trust, except maybe Bonnie. "What about Bonnie?" he asked, his voice tight. "Does she know?" Sarah shook her head. "She doesn't believe the rumors. She trusts Stone. She thinks he's the only thing standing between Harmony Creek and complete chaos." Jessie knew Bonnie's unwavering sense of justice, her fierce loyalty to her town. It was one of the things he'd always admired about her. But it also made her vulnerable, a pawn in a dangerous game. "I need to talk to her," Jessie said. "I need to warn her." Sarah looked doubtful. "She won't listen to you, Jessie. Not after everything." "I have to try," Jessie said, his voice firm. "She's in danger, and she doesn't even know it." Sarah sighed. "I'll see what I can do," she said. "But don't expect a warm welcome." She stood up to leave, then paused, her hand on his arm. "Jessie," she said, her voice earnest. "Be careful. You're walking into a viper's nest." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I know," he said, "but I have to do this. For Bonnie. And for myself." After Sarah left, Jessie sat alone in the dim light, his mind racing. He had to find a way to prove his innocence, to expose Kincaid and the sheriff, and to protect Bonnie. It was a seemingly impossible task, a devil's bargain that could cost him his life. But he had no choice. He'd come too far to turn back now. He finished his drink, the whiskey burning a path down his throat. He stood up, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his hip. He was an outlaw, a man with a price on his head, but he was also a man with a purpose. He would fight for his redemption, for his love, for the truth. Even if it meant facing down the entire town, even if it meant making a deal with the devil himself. He stepped out of the saloon and into the gathering darkness, the only sound the soft click of his spurs on the wooden sidewalk, a lonely rhythm in the quiet of the night. He was walking towards a confrontation, a reckoning, and he knew that only one of them would walk away unscathed. And he was determined to make sure it was him. The night air felt cooler now, a subtle shift that hinted at the coming storm, both literal and metaphorical. Chapter 4. Shadows of Redemption. The moon hung high in the inky sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the deserted main street of Harmony Creek. Jessie moved silently, a wraith in the darkness, his boots making barely a sound on the packed earth. He was headed for Bonnie's general store, hoping to catch her alone, to warn her about the danger he sensed lurking beneath the surface of the town. He reached the back of the store, his eyes scanning the darkened windows. A faint light flickered from within, a single lamp casting a warm glow. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He knew he was taking a risk, breaking the unspoken truce that had settled between them earlier that day. But he couldn't stand by and watch her walk blindly into a trap. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The store was filled with the familiar scent of spices, leather, and dried goods, a comforting aroma that brought back a flood of memories. He remembered the days when he'd worked alongside Bonnie, helping her father run the store, their hands brushing as they reached for the same item, their laughter echoing through the quiet space. Bonnie was standing behind the counter, her back to him, her head bent over a ledger. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid. He watched her for a moment, his heart aching with a longing he couldn't deny. She was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever known. "Bonnie," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. She startled, dropping the quill she was holding. She spun around, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. Jesse, she breathed, her hand flying to her chest. What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. He stepped closer, his eyes holding hers.
I need to talk to you, he said.
It's important. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the door, as if expecting someone to walk in. We have nothing to talk about, she said, her voice tight. We do, he insisted. It's about the stagecoach, about Kincaid, about the sheriff. Her eyes narrowed. What about them? He took another step closer, lowering his voice. They're planning to rob the stagecoach, he said. And I think the sheriff is involved. She scoffed, shaking her head. That's ridiculous. Sheriff Stone is a good man. He would never. He's not who you think he is, Bonnie, Jesse interrupted, his voice urgent. He's corrupt. He's taking bribes from Kincaid. She stared at him, her eyes searching his, trying to gauge his sincerity. He could see the doubt creeping in, the struggle between her trust in the sheriff and the nagging feeling that something wasn't right.
How do you know this?
She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I overheard Kincaid talking, Jesse said. And Sarah, she told me about the rumors. Bonnie's face paled. Sarah. Her best friend. If Sarah was suspicious of the sheriff, then maybe there was some truth to Jesse's claims. I don't know what to believe, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jesse reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. It was a familiar gesture, one that used to bring her comfort. She didn't pull away, but he could feel the tension in her body. Believe me, Bonnie, he said, his voice soft and earnest. I would never lie to you.
Not about this.
His eyes held hers, a deep, unwavering gaze that spoke of truth and something more. He could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the memory of the bond they'd once shared, the love that had burned so brightly between them. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice choked with emotion. He hesitated, his hand lingering on her cheek. Because I care about you, he said, his voice raw.
I always have.
The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The years of separation, the betrayal, the pain, all seemed to fade away in that moment, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, confusion, doubt, longing, and a flicker of hope. He couldn't be sure. Suddenly, a noise from outside shattered the fragile moment. The sound of horses' hooves, approaching fast. Jesse's hand dropped from her cheek, his body tensing. They're coming, he said, his voice urgent. You need to hide. He grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the back of the store, towards a small storage room. She stumbled, her eyes wide with fear. What's going on? She whispered.
No time to explain, he said.
Just trust me. He pushed her into the storage room, closing the door behind her. He stood there for a moment, listening to the approaching riders, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to protect Bonnie, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He drew his gun, his hand steady, his eyes focused. He was ready to face whatever came, ready to fight for the woman he loved, for the chance at redemption. He heard the horses stop outside, the shouts of men, and the creak of the front door opening. The shadows deepened, and the reckoning had begun. The scent of gun oil mingled with the familiar smells of the store, a stark contrast that highlighted the danger of the moment. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Canyon. Jesse flattened himself against the wall, his gun held ready, listening to the voices in the main part of the store. He recognized Kincaid's gruff voice, laced with a menacing undertone. Where is she, Landry? We know you're here. Jesse remained silent, his ears straining to catch any sound from the storage room where Bonnie was hidden. He hoped she was staying quiet, staying safe. Come on out, Landry, Kincaid continued. Don't make this harder than it has to be. We just want the girl. And the information you have. Jesse's grip tightened on his gun. So, they knew he was looking for something. The message he'd received, the cryptic clue that had led him back to Harmony Creek, had been a trap all along. But who had sent it?
And why?
He heard footsteps approaching, the creak of the floorboards under heavy boots. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for a confrontation. He had to buy Bonnie time, Time to escape, time to get to safety. He stepped out from behind the wall, his gun leveled at Kincaid. "Looking for me?" he said, his voice calm and steady. Kincaid grinned, a cruel, predatory smile.
Well, well, well.
The hero returns. "Thought you'd run off and leave the damsel in distress." "Not a chance," Jesse replied. "Where's she, Landry?" Kincaid demanded, his eyes darting around the store. "We know she's here." "She's not," Jesse said, his voice unwavering. "She left town this morning." Kincaid laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You expect us to believe that? You, the lovesick fool, letting your woman slip through your fingers?" "Believe what you want," Jesse said. "She's gone." Kincaid took a step closer, his hand hovering near his gun. "I don't believe you, Landry. And I'm going to find her, one way or another." Suddenly, a shot rang out, shattering the tense silence. Jesse felt a searing pain in his shoulder, the force of the bullet knocking him backward. He stumbled, his gun slipping from his grasp. He looked up, his vision blurring, to see one of Kincaid's men standing there, a smoking gun in his hand. He'd been caught off guard, distracted by Kincaid. A rookie mistake. Kincaid grinned. "Looks like the game's over, Landry," he said. "Now, where is she?" Jesse gritted his teeth, fighting back the pain. He wouldn't give Bonnie up, not even if it cost him his life. "Go to hell," he spat. Kincaid's grin faded, replaced by a look of cold fury.
"Fine," he said.
"Have it your way." He signaled to his men, and they moved in, surrounding Jesse, their guns trained on him. He was trapped, outnumbered, and wounded, but he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't let them win. He looked towards the storage room, his eyes sending a silent message to Bonnie.
"Run.
Get out of here." Suddenly, a crash from the back of the store startled everyone. A figure burst out of the storage room, a blur of motion, wielding a heavy iron skillet. It was Bonnie. She swung the skillet with all her might, connecting with the head of one of Kincaid's men. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious.
"Bonnie, no."
Jesse shouted, his voice filled with desperation. She ignored him, her eyes blazing with fury. She swung the skillet again, striking another man, sending him reeling. "Get her!" Kincaid roared. The men turned their attention to Bonnie, their guns raised. Jesse knew he had to do something, anything, to protect her. He lunged forward, tackling one of the men, knocking him off balance. A chaotic melee ensued, a flurry of fists, gunshots, and shouts. Jesse fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, his pain forgotten in the adrenaline rush. He managed to disarm one man, grabbing his gun and firing at another. But there were too many of them. He felt a blow to the head, and the world went black. When he came to, he was tied to a chair, his head throbbing, his shoulders screaming in pain. He was in the back room of the saloon, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and blood. Kincaid was standing over him, a cruel smile on his face. "Well, Landry," he said, "looks like you're out of luck." He looked around, his heart sinking. Bonnie was nowhere to be seen. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. Kincaid chuckled.
"Don't worry about her," he said.
"She's safe for now. We're taking her with us. She'll be our little insurance policy." Jesse felt a surge of rage, a burning hatred for Kincaid and his men. He struggled against his bonds, but they were too tight. "You won't get away with this," he growled.
Kincaid laughed.
"Oh, I think we will," he said. "We have friends in high places, remember? The sheriff is on our side." He leaned closer, his voice a menacing whisper. "We're heading to Echo Canyon," he said. "That's where we'll meet our contact. And that's where we'll get rid of you, Landry. Once and for all." He signaled to his men, and they dragged Jesse out of the saloon, throwing him onto the back of a horse. He was bruised, battered, and bleeding, but he wasn't broken. He would find a way to escape, to rescue Bonnie, to expose Kincaid and the sheriff. He had to. His life and Bonnie's depended on it. The ride was rough, jarring his injured shoulder, but the pain was secondary to the fear gnawing at him, the fear for Bonnie's safety. He had to find a way. The whispers of the wind seemed to carry a taunt, a challenge, as they rode towards the ominous shadows of Echo Canyon. Chapter 6. The price of freedom. Echo Canyon was a desolate, forbidding place, a labyrinth of towering rock formations and narrow passageways. The air was still and heavy, the silence broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows, painting the canyon walls in hues of blood red and deep purple. It was a place of secrets, of hidden dangers, a perfect place for a rendezvous or an ambush. Jesse, his hands tied behind his back, was forced to ride at the head of the Kincaid gang, his injured shoulder throbbing with every jolt of the horse. He scanned the terrain, his eyes searching for any sign of Bonnie, any opportunity to escape. He knew his chances were slim, but he had to try. He saw her then, tied to a horse a short distance ahead, her face pale but her eyes defiant. She met his gaze, a flicker of hope in her eyes. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, trying to reassure her, to let her know he wouldn't give up. Kincaid rode beside him, a smug grin on his face. "Enjoying the view, Landry?" he sneered. "It'll be the last thing you see." Jesse ignored him, his mind racing, trying to formulate a plan. He had to find a way to distract them, to create an opening, to give Bonnie a chance to escape. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, Jesse saw his opportunity. A narrow passage, barely wide enough for a single horse, led off to the left, disappearing into the shadows. It was a risky move, but it was his only chance. He spurred his horse, forcing it into the narrow passage. The animal balked, its hooves scraping against the rock walls, but Jesse urged it forward, his body tense, his eyes focused. Kincaid shouted in surprise, his men momentarily stunned by Jesse's sudden move. They tried to follow, but the narrow passage slowed them down, creating a bottleneck. "Get him!" Kincaid roared. "Don't let him escape." Jesse rode like the wind, his horse navigating the treacherous passage with surprising agility. He could hear the shouts of the Kincaids behind him, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing through the canyon. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever, but he had bought himself some time. He reached the end of the passage, emerging into a small, hidden valley. He reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the area. It was a dead end, a box canyon with sheer rock walls on 3 sides. He was trapped. But he wasn't alone. He saw a figure standing near the edge of the valley, a familiar figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Sheriff Stone. Jesse's heart sank. He'd hoped, against all odds, that the sheriff might be his salvation.
But now he knew the truth.
Stone wasn't on it. Part of Kincaid's plan all along. Well, Landry, Stone said, his voice echoing through the valley. "Looks like you've reached the end of the road." Jesse dismounted, his hands still tied behind his back, his eyes fixed on Stone. "You set me up," he said, his voice cold. "You sent me that message." Stone smiled, a chilling, mirthless smile. "Guilty as charged," he said. "I needed you out of the way. You were getting too close to the truth." "The truth about what?" Jesse demanded. "The truth about this town," Stone said. "About the gold, about the power, about the deals that have been made." He stepped closer, his eyes glinting in the fading light. "You see, Landry," he said, "Harmony Creek is a gold mine in more ways than one. And I intend to control it, all of it." "You're a disgrace to that badge," Jesse said, his voice filled with contempt. Stone laughed. "The badge is just a symbol, Landry," he said. "It means nothing. Power is what matters. And I have it." He turned and looked towards the entrance of the valley, where Kincaid and his men were now emerging. Bonnie was with them, still tied to her horse, her eyes wide with fear. "Bring her forward," Stone ordered. Kincaid pushed Bonnie's horse toward Stone, a cruel grin on his face. "Here's your prize, Sheriff," he said. "The little bird who knows too much." Stone looked at Bonnie, his eyes cold and calculating. "You've been a thorn in my side, Miss McCall," he said. "But now you're going to be useful." He turned back to Jesse, his expression hardening. "You have a choice, Landry," he said. "Tell me what you know, and I might let you live. Refuse, and you both die." Jesse looked at Bonnie, his heart aching. He couldn't let her die. He had to protect her, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He took a deep breath, his mind made up. The price of freedom was high, but he was willing to pay it. The air grew still, the silence amplifying the weight of his decision, the echoes of the canyons seeming to hold their breath. Chapter 7. Unspoken Truths. Jesse looked into Bonnie's eyes, seeing the fear, but also the unwavering strength that had always drawn him to her. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about saving her, about protecting the one person who had, despite everything, still held a piece of his heart. "I know nothing that will help you, Stone," Jesse said, his voice firm, though his insides churned with a mix of anger and despair. He wouldn't betray the real reason he'd come back, the real information he sought, not to this corrupt man. Stone's eyes narrowed. "Don't play coy with me, Landry. You came back for a reason. Something brought you back to Harmony Creek after all these years. Something more than just a woman." Jesse remained silent, his gaze locked with Bonnie's. He tried to convey a message to her, a silent plea for her to be strong, to be ready for whatever might happen. Kincaid stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "Enough of this, Sheriff. Let's just kill him and be done with it." Stone held up a hand, silencing Kincaid. "Not yet," he said. "I want to know what he knows. And I want to know who sent him that message." He turned back to Jesse, his voice hardening. "Last chance, Landry. Tell me the truth, or you both die." Jesse knew he couldn't reveal the real reason he was there, the lead he'd been following about his father's murder, the evidence that implicated someone in Harmony Creek, someone close to Bonnie. He couldn't risk putting her in even greater danger. "I told you," Jesse said, his voice strained. "I came back for Bonnie. That's all." Stone studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching, probing. He seemed to sense that Jesse was holding something back, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Very well," Stone said finally, a sigh of resignation escaping his lips. "If that's how you want it." He nodded to Kincaid, a silent order. Kincaid grinned, drawing his gun. Bonnie gasped, her eyes widening in horror.
"Jesse, no," she cried.
But before Kincaid could pull the trigger, a voice rang out from the canyon walls. "Hold it right there, Stone." Everyone turned, their eyes searching for the source of the voice. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing figure with a rifle in his hands. It was Jedediah Stone's deputy, a quiet, unassuming man named Thomas, whom everyone, including Jesse, had underestimated. Stone's face paled. "Thomas," he said, his voice betraying his surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I'm doing my job, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice firm. "Something you seem to have forgotten." He stepped forward, his rifle trained on Stone. "I've been watching you, Sheriff," he said. "I've seen the meetings with Kincaid, the bribes, the corruption. It ends now." Stone laughed, a hollow, desperate sound. "You're a fool, Thomas," he said. "You can't stop me." "Maybe not alone," Thomas said. "But I'm not alone." He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. Suddenly, figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding the valley. They were townsfolk, armed with rifles and shotguns, their faces grim and determined. Sarah was among them, her eyes fixed on Bonnie with a mixture of relief and concern. Bonnie's heart soared. She'd lost hope, believing that everyone in Harmony Creek had been cowed by Kincaid and Stone. But she'd been wrong. There were still good people in the town, people who were willing to fight for what was right. Stone looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was trapped, outnumbered, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him. "You betrayed me," he said to Thomas, his voice filled with bitterness. "I swore an oath to uphold the law, Sheriff," Thomas said. "Not to serve a corrupt tyrant." He nodded to the townsfolk, and they moved in, disarming Kincaid and his men. Stone tried to resist, but he was quickly overpowered. Jesse, his hands still tied, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He'd been saved, not by his own cunning, but by the courage of a few good people, people who had refused to be intimidated by fear and corruption. Bonnie, her bonds loosened by Sarah, rushed to Jesse's side, her eyes filled with tears. She helped him untie his hands, her fingers trembling. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "I am now," he said, his voice soft. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something more. The unspoken truths hung between them, the years of hurt and betrayal, the lingering feelings that had never truly died. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of what they had both endured, with the uncertain future that lay ahead. The setting sun cast a warm glow on their faces, a promise of a new dawn, a new beginning. But the shadows of the canyon still lingered, a reminder of the darkness they had just escaped and the secrets that still remained hidden. Chapter 8. Beneath a Blood Moon. The tension in Echo Canyon slowly dissipated as the townsfolk, led by Deputy Thomas, secured Kincaid and his gang. Sheriff Stone stood defeated, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and resentment. The blood moon, rising slowly above the canyon rim, cast an eerie, almost supernatural glow over the scene, a silent witness to the night's events. Jesse, his shoulder throbbing but his spirit buoyed by the unexpected turn of events, watched as Bonnie tended to his wound. Her touch was gentle, her eyes filled with concern. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed her, how much her presence grounded him, even in the midst of chaos. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "For the skillet." She gave him a small, wry smile. "It's a handy weapon," she said. "Comes in useful sometimes." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a sharp pain through his shoulder. He winced, and her smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said. "Later," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "There's something I need to do first." He looked toward Stone, who was being led away by Deputy Thomas. "I need to know who sent that message," he said. "The one that brought me back here." Bonnie's eyes widened. "You think Stone knows?" Jesse nodded. "He admitted it was a setup. He wanted me out of the way. But I don't think he was working alone." He turned to Sarah, who was standing nearby, her face pale but her expression resolute.
"Sarah," he said,
"Do you know anything about this? Anything at all?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously. She looked at Bonnie, then back at Jesse. "I heard whispers," she said, her voice low. "Rumors about someone else being involved, someone powerful." "Who?" Jesse pressed, his voice urgent. Sarah took a deep breath. "They called him the Raven," she said. "I don't know who he is or what he wants. But I know he's dangerous." The Raven. The name sent a chill down Jesse's spine. He'd heard whispers of this mysterious figure before, a shadowy figure who pulled the strings from behind the scenes, a man who controlled the flow of gold, of power, of information throughout the territory. "We need to find him," Jesse said, his voice firm. "He's the key to all of this." He looked at Bonnie, his eyes searching hers. "I need your help," he said. "Will you help me?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the departing figures of Stone and Kincaid. She knew the risks, the dangers that lay ahead. But she also knew she couldn't turn her back on him, not now. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'll help you." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. It was a familiar gesture, one that brought back a flood of memories, of shared laughter, of stolen kisses, of a love that had been tested by time and betrayal. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "I don't know what I would have done without you." She leaned into his touch, her eyes meeting his. The years of separation, the hurt, the anger, all seemed to fade away in that moment, leaving only the raw, undeniable connection between them. The blood moon hung high in the sky, casting its eerie glow over the canyon. The air was still, the silence broken only by the soft whisper of the wind. It was a moment of peace, a moment of respite, before the storm. They knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous. They were facing a powerful, unknown enemy, a man who controlled the shadows, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. But they were together, united by a shared purpose, by a lingering love, by a determination to uncover the truth. As they stood there, beneath the blood moon, A new understanding passed between them, an unspoken promise. They would face the future together, whatever it may hold. They would fight for justice, for redemption, for the chance to finally put the past behind them. The echoes of the canyon seemed to whisper their names, a testament to their courage, their resilience, their enduring bond. The night was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. The air, though still carrying the metallic scent of their recent confrontation, felt lighter, charged with a new sense of purpose.
Chapter 9.
The Sheriff's Secret. The ride back to Harmony Creek was silent and tense. Jesse, his injured shoulder bound tightly by Bonnie, rode alongside Deputy Thomas, who was now acting sheriff. The captured Kincaid gang and the disgraced Sheriff Stone were secured, their fate hanging in the balance. The blood moon, now descending towards the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows, making the familiar landscape seem alien and foreboding. As they entered the town, Jesse noticed the wary glances of the townsfolk. They had witnessed the dramatic events in the canyon, the exposure of Stone's corruption, the unexpected bravery of Deputy Thomas, and a handful of their own. The air was thick with uncertainty, with the fear of the unknown, with the realization that their sense of security had been shattered. They reached the sheriff's office, a small, sturdy building that had once represented law and order in Harmony Creek. Now, it felt tainted, a symbol of betrayal and deceit. Deputy Thomas, his face grim but resolute, ordered Stone to be locked in a cell. The former sheriff, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and defiance, offered no resistance. He knew he was defeated, his reign of terror over. Jesse, his mind racing, knew he couldn't waste any time. He needed to find out more about the Raven, about the network of corruption that had infiltrated Harmony Creek. He needed to find the evidence that would clear his name and bring the true criminals to justice. Thomas, Jesse said, his voice firm. I need to search Stone's office. There might be something there, some clue, some connection to this Raven. Thomas hesitated, his eyes flickering to Bonnie, then back to Jesse. He knew Jesse's reputation, his past as an outlaw. He wasn't sure he could trust him. I don't know, Landry, Thomas said. You're not exactly a lawman. I may not be a lawman, Jesse said, but I'm the only one who knows what to look for. I'm the one who's been chasing this ghost for years. He looked at Bonnie, his eyes pleading. Help me convince him, he said.
Please.
Bonnie stepped forward, her gaze meeting Thomas's. He's right, Thomas, she said. Jesse is the only one who can do this. He's the only one who understands the stakes. She placed a hand on Thomas's arm, her touch conveying a sense of urgency and trust. We need to find the truth, she said. And Jesse is our best chance. Thomas looked at Bonnie, then at Jesse, his expression wavering. He knew Bonnie was a woman of integrity, a woman who wouldn't vouch for someone she didn't trust. He also knew that Jesse had risked his life to save her, to protect the town. Finally, he nodded. All right, Landry, he said. You can search the office. But I'll be right here, watching you. Jesse nodded, his gratitude evident. He entered Stone's office, his eyes scanning the room. It was a small, sparsely furnished space, with a desk, a chair, a gun rack, and a few file cabinets. The air was stale and musty, the scent of old paper and stale tobacco lingering in the air. He started with the desk, carefully examining the drawers, searching for any hidden compartments, any secret documents. He found nothing but routine paperwork, bills, and official correspondence. He moved to the file cabinets, his fingers tracing the dusty surfaces. He opened each drawer, meticulously sifting through the files, his eyes scanning the labels. He found nothing of interest, nothing that seemed to connect Stone to the Raven. He was about to give up when he noticed something odd. One of the file drawers was slightly ajar, as if it hadn't been closed properly. He pulled it open, and his heart skipped a beat. Inside, he found a hidden compartment, a false bottom that concealed a small, locked box. He carefully lifted the box out of the drawer, his hands trembling with anticipation. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was it. This was the key to unlocking the secrets of Harmony Creek. He tried to open the box, but it was locked. He needed a key, or a way to force it open. He looked around the office, his eyes searching for anything that might help. He spotted a small, silver letter opener on the desk, its blade sharp and pointed. He grabbed it, his hand steady, his mind focused. He carefully inserted the blade into the lock, working it back and forth, trying to pick the mechanism. He heard a click, and the lock sprang open. He lifted the lid of the box, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, he found a collection of documents, letters, and photographs, all carefully arranged. He reached in and pulled out the first document, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. It was a letter, addressed to Sheriff Stone, from someone identifying himself only as the Raven. Jesse's heart pounded in his chest. He had found it. The proof he'd been searching for. The sheriff's secret was out. The quiet of the office was broken only by the rustling of the papers, each one a potential piece of the puzzle, a step closer to unraveling the truth. The air felt thick with anticipation, with the weight of discovery. Chapter 10. A Town Divided. Jesse carefully examined the contents of the box, his mind racing to piece together the fragmented information. The letters from the Raven detailed a complex network of corruption involving not only Sheriff Stone and the Kincaid gang, but also several prominent figures in Harmony Creek and beyond. There were coded references to gold shipments, land deals, and political influence, all orchestrated by this mysterious figure who seemed to control everything from the shadows. One name, in particular, kept recurring in the letters: Mayor Silas Thornton. Jesse's blood ran cold. Thornton was a respected figure in Harmony Creek, a man known for his philanthropy and his commitment to the town's prosperity. He was also Bonnie's uncle, her father's brother. Jesse felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Could it be true? Could Bonnie's uncle be the Raven, the mastermind behind all the chaos and violence that had plagued Harmony Creek? He looked up at Bonnie, who was standing beside him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He hesitated, unsure of how to break the news to her, how to tell her that her own family might be involved in this web of deceit. "What is it, Jesse?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What have you found?" He took a deep breath, his voice strained.
"It's complicated," he said.
"There are a lot of names here, a lot of connections." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "One name keeps appearing," he said.
Mayor Thornton.
Bonnie's face paled. "My uncle?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. That's impossible." "He wouldn't, I don't know, Bonnie," Jesse said, his voice filled with regret. "But his name is all over these documents. There are references to him, coded messages, instructions." Bonnie shook her head, her eyes filled with disbelief.
"I don't believe it," she said.
"There has to be some mistake." Jesse wished he could believe her, wished he could offer her some comfort, some reassurance. But the evidence was right there in front of him, undeniable and damning.
"We need to find out more," he said.
"We need to confront Thornton, to get to the truth." Bonnie hesitated, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of her beloved uncle with the accusations contained in the letters. She'd always trusted him, looked up to him. He'd been a father figure to her after her own father had died. "I don't know, Jesse," she said, her voice wavering.
This is my family."
"I know," Jesse said, his voice soft. "But we can't ignore this. We can't let the Raven continue to control Harmony Creek, to destroy lives." He placed a hand on her arm, his touch gentle and reassuring. "We'll do this together," he said. "I promise you, we'll find the truth." Bonnie looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the determination in his gaze, the unwavering commitment to justice, the love and concern that shone through his rugged exterior. She knew he was right. She couldn't turn a blind eye, not even for her family. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." They left the sheriff's office, their steps purposeful, their hearts heavy with the weight of their discovery. The town was quiet, the streets deserted, but the air was thick with tension, with the unspoken fear of what was to come. As they walked towards the mayor's office, they saw a group of townsfolk gathered outside, their faces grim and anxious. They were whispering amongst themselves, their eyes darting nervously towards the office. Sarah was among them, her face pale but her expression resolute. She saw Jessie and Bonnie approaching, and she rushed towards them. "What's going on?" Bonnie asked, her voice urgent. "It's Thornton," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He knows. He knows about the letters, about the raid in the canyon. He's barricaded himself in his office, and he's armed." Jessie's heart sank. This was worse than he'd feared. Thornton was desperate, cornered, and he was willing to fight. "We need to get him out of there," Jessie said, "before he hurts someone or himself." He looked at the gathered townsfolk, his eyes searching for allies. He saw fear, but he also saw a flicker of determination, a willingness to stand up for what was right. "We need to work together," he said, his voice loud and clear. "We need to show Thornton that he can't control us anymore. We need to take back our town." His words resonated with the crowd, stirring a sense of unity, a shared purpose. They had been divided by fear and suspicion, but now they were united against a common enemy. Harmony Creek was a town divided no more. The quiet determination in the eyes of the townsfolk was a powerful force, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The air, once heavy with fear, now crackled with a sense of righteous anger, of impending confrontation. Chapter 11. The Outlaw's Code. Jessie, Bonnie, and Sarah, backed by the increasingly resolute townsfolk, approached the mayor's office cautiously. The building, usually a symbol of civic pride, now loomed like a fortress, its windows dark and menacing. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the nervous whispers of the crowd and the distant howl of a coyote. Jessie knew they couldn't simply storm the office. Thornton was armed and desperate, and any rash action could lead to bloodshed. He needed a plan, a way to get Thornton to surrender peacefully, or at least to minimize the risk of violence. He turned to the townsfolk, his voice low but firm. "We need to surround the building," he said. "But stay out of sight. Don't give him any targets. I'll try to talk to him, to reason with him." The townsfolk nodded, their faces grim but determined. They dispersed quickly and quietly, taking up positions around the building, their rifles and shotguns held ready. Jessie turned to Bonnie and Sarah, his eyes filled with concern. "You two stay here," he said. "It's too dangerous." Bonnie shook her head, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I'm not leaving you, Jessie," she said. "I'm going with you." Sarah nodded in agreement. "Me too," she said. "We're in this together." Jessie hesitated, his heart torn between his desire to protect them and his need for their support. He knew he couldn't win this fight alone. "All right," he said finally, his voice resigned. "But stay close to me, and do exactly as I say." They nodded, their faces pale but resolute. Jessie took a deep breath, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. He knew this was a gamble, a dangerous game of cat and mouse. But he had no choice. He had to confront Thornton, to expose his crimes, to bring him to justice. He approached the front door of the office, his steps slow and deliberate. He raised his hand and knocked, the sound echoing through the silent building. "Thornton," he shouted, his voice loud and clear. "It's Jessie Landry. I know you're in there.
Come out and talk to me."
There was no response, only silence. Jessie waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew Thornton was listening, weighing his options, calculating his chances. He knocked again, louder this time. "Thornton," he shouted. "This is your last chance. Come out now, or we're coming in." Still no response. Jessie exchanged a look with Bonnie and Sarah. They knew what they had to do. Jessie signaled to the townsfolk, and they began to move closer, their weapons raised. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening on his gun. He kicked the door open, bursting into the office, his gun leveled. The office was dark and empty. The only light came from the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Jessie scanned the space, his eyes darting from corner to corner. "He's gone," he said, his voice filled with frustration. Bonnie and Sarah entered the office, their eyes wide with surprise. They searched the room, looking for any sign of Thornton, any clue to his whereabouts. "There's a back door," Sarah said, pointing to a small, partially hidden door in the rear of the office. Jesse rushed to the door, his heart pounding. He kicked it open, bursting into a small, overgrown alleyway. He saw a figure running down the alley, disappearing into the darkness. It was Thornton. Jesse gave chase, his boots pounding on the cobblestones. He could hear Thornton's ragged breathing, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the narrow alleyway. He was gaining on him, closing the distance. He raised his gun, his finger on the trigger. He had a clear shot, but he hesitated. He couldn't shoot him in the back. It wasn't the outlaw's code, the unwritten law that governed even the most hardened criminals. It wasn't right. He lowered his gun, his mind racing. He had to find another way, a way to capture Thornton without resorting to unnecessary violence. He saw an opportunity. A narrow passage led off to the left, a shortcut that might allow him to cut Thornton off. He veered into the passage, his body tense, his eyes focused. He emerged from the passage just ahead of Thornton, blocking his path. Thornton skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with surprise and fear. He was trapped. Jesse raised his gun, his voice calm and steady. "It's over, Thornton," he said. "Drop your weapon." Thornton hesitated, his eyes darting around nervously. He was cornered, defeated, his reign of terror over. He slowly lowered his gun, letting it fall to the ground with a clatter. Jesse kept his gun trained on Thornton, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. He had trusted this man, respected him, and he had been betrayed. "Why, Thornton?" he asked, his voice laced with bitterness. "Why did you do it?" Thornton looked at him, his face a mask of shame and regret. "Power," he said, his voice barely a whisper.
"Greed. It had consumed me."
He looked at Bonnie, his eyes filled with tears.
"I'm sorry, Bonnie," he said.
"I never meant to hurt you." Bonnie stood there, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. She couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to express the depth of her betrayal. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by Thornton's sobs. The outlaw's code had been upheld, but the price was a shattered trust, a family torn apart. The air was heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions, with the realization that some wounds might never heal. Chapter 12. Scars of the Past. The arrest of Mayor Thornton sent shockwaves through Harmony Creek. The townsfolk, who had once looked up to him as a leader, were now grappling with the reality of his betrayal. The revelation that he was the Raven, the mastermind behind the town's troubles, shattered their sense of security and trust. Jesse, Bonnie, and Sarah stood in the town square, watching as Deputy Thomas led Thornton away to the jail. The crowd was silent, their faces etched with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and sadness. The once familiar faces of their neighbors now seemed foreign, tinged with the suspicion and uncertainty that had taken root in their community. Bonnie, in particular, was struggling to come to terms with her uncle's actions. She had always considered him a father figure, a source of strength and guidance. The discovery of his deceit was a devastating blow, a wound that cut deep to her core. Jesse, sensing her pain, placed a comforting hand on her arm. He knew what it was like to be betrayed by someone you trusted, to have your world turned upside down by a single act of treachery. "I'm here for you, Bonnie," he said, his voice soft and earnest. "We'll get through this together." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "How could he do this, Jesse?" she whispered. "How could he betray us all?" Jesse had no easy answers. He knew that greed and power could corrupt even the most seemingly righteous individuals. He'd seen it happen time and time again in his own life, in his own past. "I don't know, Bonnie," he said. "But we can't let his actions define us. We need to find a way to heal, to rebuild our trust, to move forward." He looked at the gathered townsfolk, his eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and determination. He knew they were all hurting, all struggling to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed their lives. "We need to come together," he said, his voice loud and clear. "We need to support each other, to help each other heal. We need to show the world that Harmony Creek is stronger than this, that we won't be defined by the actions of one man." His words resonated with the crowd, stirring a flicker of hope in their hearts. They had been through a lot, but they were not broken. They were survivors, resilient and determined to rebuild their lives, their community. Sarah stepped forward, her face pale but her expression resolute.
He's right, she said.
We can't let Thornton win. We need to stand together to show him that we won't be intimidated by fear or corruption. Her words were met with nods of agreement, with murmurs of support. The townsfolk began to gather closer, drawing strength from each other, finding solace in their shared experience. Jesse knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. There were still many unanswered questions, many wounds that needed to heal. But he also knew that they were not alone. They had each other, and they had the strength of their community to rely on. He looked at Bonnie, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. He had come back to Harmony Creek seeking redemption, seeking to clear his name. But he had found something more, something far more valuable, a renewed sense of purpose, a rekindled love, and a community that had embraced him, despite his past. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the town square, Jesse felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. The scars of the past were still there, etched deep into his soul, but they were no longer defining him. He was no longer just an outlaw, a man on the run. He was a part of something bigger, something more meaningful. He was a part of Harmony Creek. He reached out and took Bonnie's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. She squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. He saw a flicker of hope in her gaze, a glimmer of the strong, resilient woman he had always loved. They were both changed, marked by the events that had unfolded, but their connection, their love, had endured. The quiet strength of their joined hands was a testament to their resilience, a promise of a future together, a future built on trust and a shared commitment to healing. The air, though still carrying the scent of recent turmoil, felt lighter, charged with a new sense of hope, of community. Chapter 13. A Gathering Storm. With Thornton in jail, Harmony Creek began the slow, arduous process of healing. Deputy Thomas, now acting sheriff, worked tirelessly to restore order and rebuild trust within the community. The truth about Thornton's corruption had shaken the town to its core, but it had also revealed a strength and resilience that many had not realized they possessed. Jesse, despite his initial reluctance to get involved, found himself drawn into the effort to rebuild Harmony Creek. His knowledge of the criminal underworld, his understanding of the forces that had preyed upon the town, proved invaluable to Thomas. He helped to identify Thornton's remaining accomplices, to track down stolen gold, and to ensure that justice was served. Bonnie, too, was deeply involved in the recovery effort. She worked tirelessly to help her neighbors, to provide comfort and support to those who had been affected by Thornton's betrayal. She also began to delve into her uncle's affairs, trying to understand his motivations, trying to unravel the complex web of deceit that he had woven. As they worked side by side, Jesse and Bonnie found their bond deepening. The shared experience of facing danger, of overcoming adversity, had forged a connection between them that was stronger than ever before. They found solace in each other's company, drawing strength from each other's presence. But the peace they found was fragile, threatened by the lingering shadows of the past. Jesse knew that the Ravens' network was vast and far-reaching, and that Thornton was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. He feared that there were others out there, others who were still pulling the strings, still plotting to exploit Harmony Creek. One evening, as Jesse and Bonnie were walking home from the general store, they were approached by a stranger. He was a tall, imposing figure, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by the shadows of his hat. "Mr. Landry," the stranger said, his voice low and menacing. "I have a message for you." Jesse's hand instinctively went to his gun, his eyes narrowing.
"Who are you?"
he demanded. The stranger ignored the question. "The Raven sends his regards," he said.
"And he has a warning for you.
Stay out of his affairs, or you will face the consequences." Jesse felt a chill run down his spine. The Raven. He was still out there, still watching, still threatening. "Tell the Raven," Jesse said, his voice firm, "that I'm not afraid of him. I'm coming for him." The stranger smiled, a chilling, mirthless smile. "We shall see," he said. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Jesse watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was just the beginning. The storm was gathering, and it was about to break over Harmony Creek. He turned to Bonnie, his eyes filled with concern. She was pale, her hands trembling. "What are we going to do, Jesse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We're going to fight," he said, his voice resolute. "We're going to expose the Raven, and we're going to bring him to justice." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "We're in this together," he said, "and we won't back down." She squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. He saw a flicker of fear in her gaze, but he also saw a determination, a strength that matched his own. "I know," she said, her voice firm. "We'll face it together." They stood there, hand in hand, silhouetted against the darkening sky. The wind howled around them, carrying the scent of dust and danger. They knew the road ahead would be perilous, filled with challenges and obstacles. But they were ready. They were united, and they were determined to fight for their future, for their love, for the peace and security of Harmony Creek. The quiet determination in their hearts was a stark contrast to the gathering storm, a beacon of hope in the face of impending darkness. The air crackled with tension, with the unspoken knowledge that the final confrontation was drawing near. Chapter 14. Crossroads of Fate. The following days were filled with a tense anticipation. Jesse, with Deputy Thomas's somewhat reluctant cooperation, began to investigate the leads found in Thornton's hidden documents. The Raven's network was even more extensive than they had initially imagined, reaching into neighboring towns and even the territorial government. It was a dangerous game, and Jesse knew that one wrong move could expose them to the Raven's wrath. Bonnie, meanwhile, was wrestling with her own demons. The betrayal of her uncle had left a deep wound, shaking her faith in family and her understanding of the world. She spent hours poring over old family letters and journals, searching for any hint of the darkness that had consumed Silas Thornton. She needed to understand, to find some closure, some way to reconcile the man she had loved and respected with the criminal he had become. One afternoon, while going through a box of her father's belongings, Bonnie found a hidden compartment in an old writing desk. Inside, she discovered a faded photograph and a letter, yellowed with age. The photograph showed her father and Silas Thornton as young men, standing alongside a third man, his face partially obscured by shadow. The letter was addressed to her father, and it was signed with a single, cryptic initial, R. Bonnie's heart skipped a beat. Could this be it? Could this be a clue to the Raven's true identity? She rushed to find Jesse, her hands trembling with excitement and trepidation. She found him at the sheriff's office, conferring with Deputy Thomas. "Jesse, I found something," she said, her voice breathless. I think it might be about the Raven." Jesse and Thomas exchanged a look, their interest piqued. Bonnie showed them the photograph and the letter, explaining her discovery. Jesse examined the photograph closely, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the setting, the old Black Ridge mine, a place that had been abandoned for years, rumored to be haunted. "This is it," he said, his voice firm. "This is where we'll find the Raven." Thomas looked skeptical. "The Black Ridge mine? That's a fool's errand, Landry. It's nothing but a pile of rubble." "Maybe," Jesse said. "But it's also a place with a history, a place with secrets. And I have a feeling the Raven is connected to those secrets." He turned to Bonnie, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern. "Are you sure you're up for this, Bonnie?" he asked. "It could be dangerous." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I need to do this, Jesse," she said. "I need to know the truth." They decided to leave for the Black Ridge mine at dawn, hoping to catch the Raven unawares. They knew they were walking into a trap, but they had no choice. They had to confront the Raven, to expose his crimes, to bring him to justice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, Jesse and Bonnie stood on the porch of her general store, watching the sky turn a fiery orange. They were both silent, lost in their own thoughts, preparing themselves for the confrontation that lay ahead. Jesse reached out and took Bonnie's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. She squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. He saw a flicker of fear in her gaze, but he also saw a courage, a resilience that he had always admired. "We'll get through this, Bonnie," he said, his voice soft. "Together." She nodded, a small smile gracing her lips. "I know," she said. "We always do." They stood there, hand in hand, their silhouettes outlined against the vibrant sunset. They were at a crossroads, a turning point in their lives. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but they were ready to face it, together. They were united by their love, by their shared purpose, by their unwavering commitment to justice. The quiet strength of their bond was a beacon of hope, a promise of a brighter future, even as they stood on the precipice of darkness. The air was still, heavy with anticipation, with the unspoken knowledge that their fate would be decided at the Black Ridge mine. The setting sun, a fiery ball of orange and red, seemed to symbolize both the end of an era and the dawn of a new one. Chapter 15. The Heart's Reckoning. The journey to the Black Ridge mine was fraught with a palpable tension. The pre-dawn air was crisp and cold, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of their horses' hooves and the occasional call of a distant owl. Jesse rode ahead, his eyes scanning the rugged terrain, his senses alert for any sign of danger. Bonnie rode beside him, her face pale but her expression resolute. Deputy Thomas, convinced of the gravity of their mission, followed close behind, his rifle held ready. As they approached the mine, the landscape grew increasingly desolate. Twisted, gnarled trees clawed at the sky, and jagged rocks jutted out from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast. The mine itself was a gaping maw in the side of the mountain, a dark and forbidding entrance to a world of forgotten secrets. Jesse reined in his horse, his gaze fixed on the mine entrance. He felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. This was it. The place where the past and the present were about to collide. "Stay close," he said to Bonnie and Thomas, his voice low and urgent. "And be ready for anything." They dismounted, tethering their horses to a nearby tree. Jesse drew his gun, his hand steady, his eyes focused. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. They entered the mine cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the dark, silent tunnels. The air was damp and cold, heavy with the scent of dust and decay. The only light came from the flickering lantern that Thomas carried, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. As they moved deeper into the mine, they began to hear sounds, the creak of timbers, the drip of water, the whisper of the wind through narrow cracks in the rock. It was a symphony of unease, a chorus of forgotten voices. Suddenly, they heard a different sound, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. Jesse raised his gun, his finger on the trigger. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the tunnel. A figure emerged from the shadows, a large, burly man with a scarred face and a menacing grin. It was one of Kincaid's men, one who had supposedly been captured and jailed. Well, Landry," the man sneered. "Looks like you walked right into our trap." Jesse's heart sank. He had been so focused on the Raven that he had overlooked the possibility of a more immediate threat. "Where is he?" Jesse demanded, his voice tight. "Where's the Raven?" The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You'll never find him," he said. "He's always one step ahead." He raised his gun, aiming it at Jesse. Bonnie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But before the man could pull the trigger, a shot rang out, echoing through the tunnel. The man crumpled to the ground, his gun clattering on the rocks. Jesse spun around, his gun raised, searching for the shooter. He saw a figure standing in the shadows, a familiar figure with a rifle in his hands. It was Deputy Thomas. "Thanks, Thomas," Jesse said, his voice filled with relief. "I owe you one." Thomas nodded, his face grim. "We're not out of the woods yet, Landry," he said. "There are more of them." He was right. They heard more footsteps approaching, the sounds of multiple men moving through the tunnels. They were surrounded. Jesse knew they had to find a way out, a way to escape the trap. He looked around, his eyes searching for any advantage, any opportunity. He saw a narrow passage leading off to the side, a dark and unexplored tunnel. It was a risky move, but it was their only chance. "This way," he said, his voice urgent. "Follow me." He plunged into the passage, Bonnie and Thomas close behind. They ran through the darkness, their footsteps echoing through the narrow tunnel. They could hear the shouts of their pursuers behind them, the sounds of their pursuit growing closer. They reached a dead end, a large cavern with a single, narrow opening at the far end. Jesse knew this was it. Their final stand. He turned to Bonnie, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. "I'm sorry, Bonnie," he said, his voice soft. "I got you into this." She shook her head, her eyes meeting his. "No," she said. "We're in this together. And we'll get through it together." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. He squeezed her hand, his heart aching with a love that he had tried to deny for so long. He turned to Thomas, his voice firm. "We'll make our stand here," he said. "We'll fight to the end." Thomas nodded, his face resolute. "We're with you, Landry," he said. They prepared for the final confrontation, their hearts pounding, their guns held ready. The echoes of the mines seemed to whisper their names, a testament to their courage, their love, their unwavering commitment to justice. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken knowledge that this was the heart of the reckoning, the place where their fate would be decided. The darkness of the mine was a stark contrast to the fire that burned within them, a fire fueled by love, loyalty, and a desperate hope for survival. Chapter 16. Betrayal's Embrace. The sounds of their pursuers grew closer, echoing through the cavern. Jesse, Bonnie, and Thomas braced themselves, their weapons raised, their eyes fixed on the narrow opening. They knew this was a fight they might not win, but they were determined to go down fighting, to protect each other, to defend the principles they held dear. Suddenly, figures burst into the cavern, their guns blazing. Jesse, Bonnie, and Thomas returned fire, the sounds of gunfire echoing through the confined space. It was a chaotic melee, a desperate struggle for survival. Jesse fought with the skill and ferocity of a cornered wolf, his movements precise and deadly. He took down 2 men, his shots finding their mark with unerring accuracy.
But there were too many of them.
He felt a searing pain in his leg, the force of a bullet knocking him off balance. Bonnie screamed, her eyes filled with terror. She fired her own weapon, a small pistol that Jesse had given her, but her aim was unsteady, her hands trembling. Thomas fought bravely, his rifle spitting fire, but he was also overwhelmed. He took a bullet to the shoulder, his body slumping against the cavern wall. Jesse, gritting his teeth against the pain, struggled to get back on his feet. He saw Bonnie standing over him, shielding him from the attackers, her pistol firing repeatedly. She was a fierce protector, a warrior in her own right. But it wasn't enough. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Jesse knew this was the end. Suddenly, a voice rang out, a voice that chilled Jesse to the bone. Enough. The firing stopped. The figures in the cavern lowered their weapons, their eyes fixed on the source of the voice. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man with a silver-haired head and piercing blue eyes. He was dressed in a fine suit, his demeanor calm and confident. It was Mayor Silas Thornton. Jesse stared at him, his mind reeling. He had been so sure that Thornton was the Raven, that he had been the mastermind behind all the chaos and violence. But he had been wrong. Thornton looked at Jesse, his expression unreadable. "You were right about one thing, Landry," he said. "I am involved. But I'm not the Raven." He turned and looked at the figure standing beside him, a figure that had been hidden in the shadows until now. A figure that made Bonnie gasp, her eyes widening in horror. It was Sarah. Bonnie stared at her best friend, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Sarah, the woman who had been her confidant, her support, her ally, was standing there, a smug smile on her face, a gun in her hand. "Sarah?" Bonnie whispered, her voice barely audible.
"But why?"
Sarah laughed, a cold, heartless sound. "Oh, Bonnie," she said. "You were always so naive, so trusting. You never suspected a thing." She stepped forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "I am the Raven," she said. "And I have been pulling the strings all along." Jessie felt a surge of rage, a burning hatred for this woman who had betrayed them all, who had manipulated them, who had used their trust and friendship for her own selfish gain. "Why, Sarah?" Jessie demanded, his voice filled with anger. "Why did you do it?" Sarah shrugged, her expression indifferent. "Power, Landry," she said. "Greed. The same reasons as always." She explained her plan, her voice filled with a chilling pride. She had been manipulating Thornton for years, using his position and influence to further her own ambitions. She had used the Kincaid gang to do her dirty work, to eliminate her enemies, to control the flow of gold from the Black Ridge mine. She had sent the message to Jesse, knowing that he would come back to Harmony Creek, knowing that he would stir up trouble, knowing that he would lead her to the evidence that Thornton had hidden. She had planned to kill them all, to tie up all the loose ends, to take control of everything. Bonnie stared at Sarah, her heart breaking. She couldn't believe that her best friend, the woman she had trusted implicitly, was capable of such treachery. I don't understand," Bonnie said, her voice trembling. "We were friends, Sarah. We were like sisters." Sarah laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Friendship is a weakness, Bonnie," she said. "Loyalty is a liability. I learned that a long time ago." She raised her gun, aiming it at Bonnie. "Goodbye, Bonnie," she said. "It's been fun." The cavern echoed with her chilling words, the betrayal hanging heavy in the air. The sudden revelation had turned the world upside down, shattering trust and revealing the darkest depths of human nature. The flickering lantern light cast long, distorted shadows, making the scene even more surreal, more terrifying. Chapter 17. The Long Ride Home. Before Sarah could pull the trigger, a shot rang out. But it wasn't from Sarah's gun. It came from behind, from the entrance of the cavern. Sarah gasped, her eyes widening in surprise, and she crumpled to the ground, her gun falling from her grasp. Jessie, Bonnie, and Thomas stared in disbelief at the figure standing in the cavern entrance. It was Silas Thornton. He held a smoking pistol in his hand, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, regret, anger, and a strange kind of relief. "I couldn't let her do it," Thornton said, his voice hoarse. "I may be a criminal, but I'm not a murderer." He looked at Bonnie, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Bonnie," he said, "for everything." Bonnie, still reeling from the shock of Sarah's betrayal and Thornton's unexpected intervention, could only stare at him, her mind struggling to process the rapid turn of events. Jesse, his leg throbbing but his mind clear, stepped forward. "It's over, Thornton," he said. "It's all over." Thornton nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He lowered the pistol, letting it fall to the ground. He knew he had to face the consequences of his actions, that he had to pay for his crimes. Deputy Thomas, his arm bleeding but his spirit unbroken, moved to secure Thornton, his face grim but resolute. He had a duty to uphold, a town to protect, and he would do it, even if it meant arresting the man who had once been his mayor. Jesse turned to Bonnie, his eyes filled with concern. She was pale, her body trembling, her eyes fixed on Sarah's lifeless body. He knew she was in shock, that she needed time to process the trauma she had just experienced. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "Come on, Bonnie," he said softly. "Let's go home." She didn't respond, didn't move. He gently pulled her towards him, wrapping his arm around her, supporting her weight. She leaned into him, her body shaking with silent sobs. They left the cavern, leaving behind the darkness, the violence, the betrayal. They emerged into the early morning light, the sun rising above the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the rugged landscape. The ride back to Harmony Creek was slow and silent. Bonnie, still in shock, rode close to Jesse, her head resting on his shoulder. He held her tight, his presence a source of comfort and strength. Thomas, his arm bandaged, rode ahead with Thornton, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had seen too much. As they approached the town, they saw the townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces anxious and expectant. They had heard the gunshots, had sensed the danger, and they were waiting, hoping for the best, fearing the worst. When they saw Jesse and Bonnie returning, a wave of relief washed over the crowd. They rushed forward, their voices filled with concern and gratitude. They had feared the worst, had imagined the worst, but their friends, their neighbors, had survived. Jesse helped Bonnie dismount, his eyes searching hers. He saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, a glimmer of the strong, resilient woman he loved. She was still hurting, still traumatized, but she was alive and she was safe. The townsfolk surrounded them, offering words of comfort and support. They had been through a lot, but they had come through it together. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. As Jesse looked around at the faces of the people of Harmony Creek, he felt a sense of belonging, a sense of community that he had never experienced before. He had come back to this town seeking redemption, seeking to clear his name. But he had found something far more valuable, a home, a family, a love that had endured the test of time and betrayal. The long ride home was over. The journey had been arduous, filled with danger and heartbreak, but it had also been a journey of healing, of forgiveness, of redemption. The scars of the past would remain, but they would no longer define them. They would serve as a reminder of the strength they had found within themselves, of the bonds they had forged, of the love that had sustained them through the darkest of times. The air, though still carrying the faint scent of gunpowder, felt clean, fresh, filled with the promise of a new beginning. Chapter 18. Facing the Dawn. The days following the events at the Black Ridge Mine were a blur of activity and emotion. Silas Thornton was formally charged, and the full extent of his and Sarah's crimes came to light. The revelations shocked and saddened the town, but they also brought a sense of closure, a feeling that justice had finally been served. Deputy Thomas, officially appointed as the new sheriff, worked tirelessly to restore order and rebuild trust within the community. Bonnie, though still grappling with the pain of Sarah's betrayal and her uncle's involvement, found a new strength within herself. She threw herself into helping the town recover, organizing relief efforts, and providing support to those who had been affected by the turmoil. She also began the difficult process of sorting through her uncle's affairs, trying to make sense of his actions, and to find some way to reconcile the man she had loved with the criminal he had become. Jesse, his leg healing slowly but steadily, remained by Bonnie's side, offering his unwavering support and love. He helped her navigate the legal complexities of her uncle's case, providing a steady presence in her storm-tossed life. He also began to think about his own future, about the possibility of settling down, of making a life for himself in Harmony Creek. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the town, Jesse found Bonnie sitting on the porch of her general store, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. He sat down beside her, his presence a silent comfort. "How are you doing, Bonnie?" he asked softly. She sighed, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I'm processing," she said, trying to make sense of it all. "It's a lot to take in," Jesse agreed. "Betrayal, especially from someone you trust, cuts deep." She nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. I don't understand how Sarah could do it," she said. "We were like sisters." Jesse reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "Some people are just broken," he said. "They're driven by things we can't comprehend." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "But that doesn't excuse their actions," he said. "And it doesn't diminish the pain they cause." She squeezed his hand, her eyes searching his. "What about you, Jesse?" she asked. "How are you dealing with all of this?" He smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "I've had my share of betrayals, Bonnie," he said. "I've learned that you can't let the darkness consume you. You have to find the light, the good, the things that are worth fighting for." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. "And I found that, Bonnie," he said. "I've found it in you, in this town, in the possibility of a future together." Her eyes widened, a flicker of hope sparking in their depths. Together? She whispered. He nodded, his voice firm. I'm not running anymore, Bonnie, he said. I'm done with the outlaw life. I want to stay here, with you if you'll have me. Tears streamed down her cheeks, tears of relief, of joy, of a love that had been tested by time and adversity, but had emerged stronger than ever. I'll have you, Jessie Landry, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I'll always have you. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, passionate kiss that sealed their promise, their commitment to a future together. The sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the town in its warm, golden light. It was a new dawn, a new beginning, a time for healing, for forgiveness, for building a life together, a life free from the shadows of the past. As they sat there, hand in hand, watching the sunrise, they knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, and lingering scars. But they also knew that they could face anything as long as they had each other. They had found their home, their peace, their love, in the heart of Harmony Creek. The air was fresh and clean, filled with the scent of hope and the promise of a brighter future. The trials they had faced had forged a bond between them that was unbreakable, a love that would endure the test of time. Chapter 19. Redemption Song. Life in Harmony Creek gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. The wounds inflicted by Thornton and Sarah's betrayal began to heal, replaced by a renewed sense of community and a determination to build a brighter future. Sheriff Thomas proved to be a capable and just leader, earning the respect and trust of the townsfolk. Jesse, true to his word, stayed in Harmony Creek. He sold his horse and his guns, symbols of his past life, and used the money to buy a small ranch just outside of town. He spent his days working the land, tending to his livestock, and finding a quiet satisfaction in the simple rhythms of rural life. It was a far cry from the adrenaline-fueled existence of an outlaw, but it was exactly what he needed, what he craved. Bonnie continued to run the general store, her business thriving as the town recovered. She also became a pillar of the community, offering support and guidance to those who were still struggling to come to terms with the past. She found a new purpose in helping others, in building a stronger, more resilient Harmony Creek. As the months passed, Jesse and Bonnie's relationship deepened. They spent their evenings together, sharing meals, talking, and laughing. They took long walks in the surrounding countryside, exploring the beauty of the land, finding solace in each other's company. Their love was a quiet, steady flame, a source of warmth and comfort in a world that had often been cold and harsh. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of Jesse's ranch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Jesse turned to Bonnie, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. Bonnie, he said, his voice soft and earnest. I know we've been through a lot and I know we've both got scars, but I also know that I love you more than anything in the world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple, elegant silver ring. Bonnie McCall, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Will you marry me? Tears welled up in Bonnie's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had finally found its home. She nodded, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, Jesse, she whispered. Yes, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. It was a symbol of their commitment, their promise, their future together. They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. They were married a few weeks later, in a simple ceremony in the town square. The entire town turned out to celebrate, their faces beaming with joy and goodwill. It was a testament to the love that Jesse and Bonnie shared, to the respect they had earned, to the hope they represented for the future of Harmony Creek. Sheriff Thomas officiated the ceremony, his voice filled with emotion. He had seen the worst of humanity, but he had also witnessed the best, and he knew that Jesse and Bonnie were a symbol of redemption, of the power of love to overcome even the darkest of times. As Jesse and Bonnie exchanged their vows, their eyes locked, their voices firm and clear, the townsfolk cheered, their hearts filled with hope and happiness. It was a moment of pure joy, a celebration of love, of community, of a new beginning. After the ceremony, there was a feast, a celebration that lasted long into the night. There was music, dancing, and laughter, a sense of unity and camaraderie that had been missing from Harmony Creek for far too long. As Jesse and Bonnie danced together, under the starry sky, they knew that they had found their happily ever after. They had faced their demons, conquered their fears, and emerged stronger, more resilient, and more in love than ever before. They had found their redemption, their peace, their home, in the heart of Harmony Creek. And as the music played, a gentle, melodic tune, it seemed to sing a song of hope, of forgiveness, of a love that would endure the test of time. The air was filled with the scent of celebration, of joy, of a community united in its support for two people who had found their way back to each other, and in doing so, had helped to heal a town. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Years passed, and Harmony Creek flourished. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the darkness they had overcome, but they served as a testament to the town's resilience, its ability to heal and rebuild. Jesse and Bonnie's ranch became a haven, a place of peace and tranquility, where they raised their children, surrounded by the love of their family and the support of their community. Their children, a boy named Caleb and a girl named Sarah after Bonnie's mother, not her former friend, grew up hearing stories of the town's troubled past, of the outlaw who had found redemption, and of the woman who had stood by him through it all. They learned the importance of courage, of loyalty, of standing up for what's right, even in the face of adversity. Jesse and Bonnie, their hair now streaked with silver, their faces etched with the lines of time and experience, remained deeply in love. They had weathered many storms together, faced many challenges, but their bond had only grown stronger, their love more profound. One evening, as they were sitting on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in a breathtaking display of colors, Bonnie turned to Jesse, her eyes filled with a familiar twinkle. "Remember that first day you rode back into town?" she asked, a playful smile gracing her lips. Jesse chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "How could I forget?"
he said.
"You looked like you wanted to shoot me." "I almost did," Bonnie admitted. "I was so angry, so hurt. And I deserved it," Jesse said, his voice filled with regret. "I should have never left you like that." "But you came back," Bonnie said, her voice soft. "And you stayed." "I'll always stay, Bonnie," Jesse said, his voice firm. "I'll always be here for you." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. Their hands, weathered and worn, told a story of a life lived together, a life filled with love, loss, and ultimately, redemption. "We've built a good life here, Jesse," Bonnie said, her gaze sweeping over their ranch, their home. "We have," Jesse agreed. "A life I never thought I deserved." "You deserve it, Jesse," Bonnie said, her eyes meeting his. "You deserve all the happiness in the world." They sat there in silence, hand in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was ablaze with color, a final, glorious display of beauty before the darkness of night descended. As the stars began to appear, twinkling in the vast expanse above, Jesse felt a sense of peace, a sense of contentment that he had never known before. He had faced his demons, conquered his fears, and found his redemption in the love of a good woman and the embrace of a welcoming community. He had come to Harmony Creek as an outlaw, a man with a price on his head, a man haunted by his past. But he had left as a hero, a husband, a father, a man who had found his place in the world. He looked at Bonnie, his heart overflowing with love. She was his anchor, his rock, his guiding star. She had stood by him through thick and thin, had believed in him when no one else did, had helped him to become the man he was today. "I love you, Bonnie McCall," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I love you, Jesse Landry," she replied, her eyes shining with tears of joy. They kissed, a tender, passionate kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their enduring bond. It was a kiss that spoke of a lifetime of shared experiences, of challenges overcome, of a love that had conquered all. The final confrontation had not been with guns or bullets, but with the ghosts of their past, with the doubts and fears that had haunted them for so long. And they had won. They had found their peace, their happiness, their forever, in the heart of Harmony Creek, under the vast, starry sky. The air was filled with the quiet sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, a peaceful symphony that celebrated the enduring power of love and redemption. The horizons stretched out before them, vast and unknown, but they faced them together, hand in hand, their hearts filled with hope and a quiet, unwavering certainty that their love would endure, forever and always. Epilogue. The wind whispered through the tall grasses surrounding the small, weathered headstone. Bonnie, her hair now completely silver, her face lined with the wisdom and sorrows of a long life, stood before it, a single, faded wildflower clutched in her hand. The inscription on the headstone read, Jesse Landry. Beloved husband, father, and friend. He found his redemption. It had been 10 years since Jesse had passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his family. 10 years since Bonnie had lost the love of her life, the man who had ridden back into her world and changed it forever. She knelt down, placing the wildflower at the base of the headstone. The tears that welled up in her eyes were not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude, of remembrance, of a love that had transcended time and death. I miss you, Jesse, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. But I know you're at peace. She stood there for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the headstone, her mind filled with memories of their life together. She remembered the day he had returned to Harmony Creek, dusty and dangerous, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and longing. She remembered the trials they had faced, the betrayals they had endured, the battles they had fought, both together and apart. She remembered the love they had shared, a love that had been tested by time and adversity, but had emerged stronger, more resilient, more profound. She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. Jesse had found his redemption, not in clearing his name, not in defeating his enemies, but in the love he had shared with her, in the life they had built together, in the legacy he had left behind. She turned and looked out over the rolling hills, over the town of Harmony Creek, the town that had once been divided by fear and suspicion, but was now united by a shared history, by a commitment to justice and community. Jesse, and she had played a part in that transformation, in that healing. She felt a gentle breeze caress her cheek, and she imagined it was Jesse's touch, his presence, his love, surrounding her, comforting her. She knew he was always with her, in her heart, in her memories, in the spirit of Harmony Creek. She took a deep breath, the scent of the wildflowers filling her lungs. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. It was a beautiful evening, a peaceful evening, a perfect ending to a long and fulfilling life. Bonnie turned and walked away from the grave, her steps slow but steady. She had lived a full life, a life filled with love, loss, and ultimately, redemption. She had faced her demons, conquered her fears, and found her peace. As she walked, she heard the faint sound of music, a gentle, melodic tune that seemed to drift on the wind. It was the song that had played at their wedding, the song that had become their anthem, their testament to the enduring power of love. She smiled, her heart filled with a quiet joy. She knew that her time was drawing near, that she would soon be joining Jesse, her beloved husband, her soulmate, her partner in life and in love. And as she walked towards the setting sun, she knew that their story, the story of the outlaw and the woman who had loved him, would live on, a legend whispered on the wind, a testament to the power of redemption, of forgiveness, of a love that could conquer all. The vast, starry sky above seemed to embrace her, a promise of eternal peace, of a reunion with her beloved Jesse, a final, beautiful chapter in their enduring love story.